everybody.
Hi, Jordan.
Hi. Okay. So the title of my presentation is Exploring Repetitions. Group therapy is a laboratory for working through unconscious patterns. My foray into group therapy began when I stumbled upon the annual conference of the Colorado Group Psychotherapy Society in the fall of my first year here at Naroba. Initially, I thought it was a conference on addiction because it was held at an addiction rehab facility. So you can imagine my surprise when I walked into a room that looked a little something like this. Turns out, I had walked into an interpersonal process group experience, and over the course of the next 6 hours, 7 strangers and I sat in a circle and we interacted. We were told that our only job was to put our thoughts and feelings into words and to share what was coming up for us in the moment. The rawness and transparency of the whole thing was extremely exhilarating to me and terrifying. From that point on, I was hooked. I became involved in everything group-related that I could get my hands on. I joined the board of the Colorado Group Psychotherapy Society, and I attended their annual conference in New York. I began to attend a training school for group therapy in New York as well, and I joined a weekly group here in Boulder that I'm still a part of today. There's an elusive quality to what exactly it is that I find so enthralling and powerful about group. And this capstone's been an opportunity for me to sit down and really analyze and dissect the experience of being in a group. Through my firsthand experience, as well as drawing from a number of books and talks from therapists in the field, I've come up with a model for what I believe is the process that takes place in a group. And I've gained a deeper understanding of the mechanism behind the growth and impact that I've personally experienced in group therapy. Okay, so what is group therapy? Well, there are several different types of group. First, we have support groups, which involve people coming together to give and receive support about struggles around a particular topic. So this might be something like AA or NA, a grief support group, or an eating disorder support group. Next, we have psychoeducational groups. These are designed to educate members about a specific topic. Third are modality-based groups. So these are groups that focus on a particular modality or module, like a cognitive behavioral therapy group or a dialectical behavioral therapy group. And finally, we have interpersonal process groups, which involve somewhere in the range of usually 5 to 10 people relating to one another in the moment in the room. And there's really no theme to these groups other than putting your thoughts and feelings into words. Today, I'm going to be focusing on these interpersonal process groups. To start off, I want to talk about a few misconceptions about group. So the first is that all groups are support groups. When most people hear the term group therapy, they think of a support group like AA, probably because this is what's most commonly portrayed on TV and in the movies. But as I just described, there's actually many different types of group. Next is that group is a second-rate option to individual therapy. There's this idea that group is the same as individual therapy, just a more economical but inferior option for someone who can't afford individual, kind of like a group ski lesson or something like that. But in fact, group is not just therapy light, so to speak. It's a different therapeutic modality altogether with a style, interventions, and advantages that are unique to group. And finally, what works in group works in individual, or what works in individual therapy works in group. Where a lot of therapists go wrong is in thinking that the same tools and interventions that will be effective with an individual will be effective with a group. But really, the treatment approach is entirely different. You're treating the group as a whole, as a unit unto itself with an identity of its own and a life of its own, not just as a collection of individuals receiving some kind of round-robin therapy in the same room. Now, in no way am I trying to dismiss or discredit the power and value of individual therapy here. I am an individual therapist, after all. And I think there are certainly circumstances and clients for whom individual is more appropriate. But I think that the value of group therapy often gets overlooked and underestimated, and that this can lead to a lack of awareness and a lack of training for group therapists. So what I hope to convey is that just like individual therapy has advantages over group therapy also has distinct advantages over individual. So life is full of groups. From childhood, we spend much of our time in group contexts, starting with the nuclear family system, moving on to friend groups, on sports teams, and at camp. Because we spend so much of our lives in groups from an early age, group therapy acts as a microcosm of the outside world, a laboratory to experiment with new interpersonal skills and ways of relating to ourselves and to others. But instead of a lab for something like gene modification, it's a lab for behavior modification. So we might be experimenting with something like approaching conflict. Maybe it's speaking up more or being more transparent in our relationships or asking for support. Group encourages its members to study, explore, and experiment with aspects of behavior through first-hand experience. It allows for this type of experimentation because there are explicit ground rules and guidelines which afford a sense of safety and openness to try new things and take risks in relationship. This is something that can be harder to attain in interpersonal interactions outside of group, where it can feel more threatening or intimidating. Once we've experimented in group, we can then transfer these skills into our outside lives. Now I want to take a deeper dive into this process of behavior modification that occurs through interpersonal relating in group. Specifically, I want to look at the process of overcoming repetitions, unconscious relational patterns that are no longer serving us. So, what is a repetition? Well, as I just mentioned, it's an unconscious historical pattern, defense, resistance, or impulse characteristic of an individual. It's behavior that's based on an early emotional imprint that creates an expectation for how things will unfold. It's a result of superimposing the past onto the present. Though these strategies are developed for an adaptive reason in childhood, to gain love from our parents, for example, repetitions become outdated, and they often end up hindering us in relationship and holding us back from what we most want. Louis Ormond, a psychoanalytic therapist and one of the pioneers of group in the US, said, "People in their daily lives and as patients in group therapy always create their own impasses, and in virtually the same ways. Wittingly or unwittingly, they block themselves with associates, friends, lovers, and relatives." So does anyone here think that they might have some kind of repetitive pattern from childhood playing out in their relationships today? And these are just the conscious ones, so you can imagine how pervasive this is. Repetitions are implicitly driven by a desire to have things play out differently. The unconscious thought is, if I reenact this, I can have a different experience and find healing. But unless consciousness is brought to the pattern, it continues to be harmful and destructive and can feel hopeless and exasperating, like banging your head against a wall. The function of group is to illuminate these patterns so that a corrective experience may be had, so that something different can occur. This is a model that I've created for the process behind working with repetitions or working through repetitions in group. First, we have elicit. This is when the pattern is evoked or brought out. Next is illuminate. The pattern is made conscious. And finally, transform. The behavior is modified and the pattern is overcome. And all of this is facilitated by the here and now nature of group, the focus being on what's happening between members in the present moment. So starting with elicit, this is when an ingrained behavior or repetition is played out in the group. So why is this more likely to happen in group therapy than in individual? First is that group more closely resembles real life. Because we spend so much of our lives in groups, many of our relational patterns are created in groups, which means that they may be elicited in group therapy but not in individual. In individual therapy, people often seek out a therapist who makes them feel safe and comfortable. This means they seek the kind of person least likely to elicit the self-destructive behaviors that they show to others. Group tends to offer more opportunity to recreate dynamics like those outside of group. The sheer number and diversity of people and personality types, and the fact that you can't choose who you're with in group, means that there will likely be somebody who brings out your repetitions. Next is group is activating. Group is full of frustrations like interruptions, misunderstandings, and vying for attention. These things are likely to elicit feelings of helplessness and competition, similar to those that we experienced in childhood. Feelings which are often at the root of destructive patterns that we have reinforced over a lifetime. In contrast, an individual therapist is trained in compassion, warmth, and non-judgment. When we're swaddled in a cloak of comfort and compassion, our worst sides and most unhealthy behaviors are less likely to be elicited than when we're experiencing frustrations and misunderstandings. Finally, group is in the here and now. Interpersonal interaction occurs in the here and now. This means that interpersonal reenactments of past dynamics and situations must also occur in the here and now. A repetition doesn't play out when we're talking about something from the past. It happens when we're having an experience in the present moment. I want to illustrate this point with a quote from Ormond. He says, "By focusing on their experiences of one another and engaging in the moment, members will inevitably play out their outside patterns, repetitions, and tendencies in the room." I want to illustrate this with an example about one of my fellow group members who we'll call Paul. Paul had a tendency to tell self-deprecating stories in group, emphasizing how dysfunctional he was. It exasperated everyone in group because we all saw him as extremely smart and competent. It eventually became clear that acting dysfunctional was a repetition he had developed as a way of garnering love and attention from his parents in competition with his 4 siblings. This pattern of disparaging himself was elicited in group when his competitive feelings were stirred up. Okay, so once a repetition is elicited, the next step is bringing it into awareness. This is making the unconscious conscious. What makes group so conducive to this? The first is that group offers multiple lenses and affords the opportunity to receive many reactions to our social behavior. Because we have a handful of people observing and reacting to us, this larger sample size makes for more reliable data than when we're only being witnessed by an individual therapist. The collective judgment or feedback of a whole group is harder to deny or dismiss. Next is that group interactions are a primary source. When an individual therapist hears something through only the lens of their client, they're inevitably getting a secondhand account, and it's going to be a biased report. Versus in group where interactions and dynamics play out in real time in plain view of everyone. This offers a more accurate first-hand account. Next is that group offers on-the-spot feedback. Not only is the repetition observed and identified in the present, but feedback may be delivered right then and there. Having an aha moment or having something illuminated is more likely to happen when you hear about your impact in real time than when feedback is offered after the fact. Finally, group is unfiltered. Fellow group members may offer feedback more freely and without reservation than an individual therapist will. Another quote from Ormond on this, he says, "The therapist's need to establish the relationship, to secure it, holds her back from saying what she would like to say, from citing ways in which the patient is alienating others and isolating himself. In the group arena, the other members responding to a person's criticality or pettiness have no such need to be discreet." So, returning to Paul, in response to his continued self-denigration, another member in the group, Mel, shared that she felt frustrated and exasperated when Paul spoke about himself this way. She said that it made her feel hopeless and distant from him because she didn't want to be complicit in his toxic narrative of himself and that, frankly, she didn't really buy it. Hearing Mel's perspective helped Paul to see his pattern more clearly. Okay, so once a repetition is elicited and illuminated in group, it may then be transformed or overcome. And I believe that there are two parts to this process. The first is practicing a new behavior, intervening in the repetition and doing something different. And the next is receiving a different response to that new behavior and thus having a corrective experience. So how does this happen in group? Well, first is that group is experimental. So this is the practice piece that I just mentioned. Let's go back to our laboratory here. What do we do in a laboratory? We experiment and test things out. We take risks and try things. Group encourages people to practice new behavior by catching the moment in which a repetition is about to be played out and then interrupting the behavior and doing something different. But the key is that it's experimenting or practicing in an environment that more closely resembles the outside world than an individual does. In group, people can rehearse dealing with the outside world, whereas such rehearsal may be more difficult in one-on-one therapy because it doesn't exactly mirror the outside world. Unconditional positive regard is great, and it's certainly proven to be a valuable therapeutic attitude, but the reality is that it doesn't exactly reflect the Wild West that is group outside of therapy. In the words of Ormond, traversing from the group room to the world is a much shorter step than going from the individual therapist's office to the world. The way I think of it is, if you're training for a trail race, it's going to be more helpful to train on rocky trails than on a paved road. Next is that group recreates the primary family. So while an individual may offer a corrective experience in the realm of a parent-child dynamic, group recreates family dynamics and so affords corrective experiences for wounds created in the context of the entire family system. And this type of familial transference is unique to group. Finally, group is experiential. So it offers experiential learning. And this is the having a corrective experience piece that I mentioned. I'm talking here about the power of bottom-up learning, where you're learning from doing or experiencing. You can't think your way out of this type of deeply ingrained pattern. Another way of saying this is that the learning takes place on a limbic versus a prefrontal cortex level in our brains. I suspect that this idea is understood by us here at Naropa, where so much of our learning has been experiential. Repetitions are resolved in a regressed state. This means that limbic pathways are activated in the brain and we're transported back into emotional states and identities that we occupied in our original family system. It is shuttling back into this deeply ingrained operating system, something that lives in us at a cellular, unconscious level in our bodies, that makes the transformation of these outdated patterns possible. Repetitions are created through emotional experiences and therefore must be reworked through emotional experiences. Another term for this is limbic revision. It is having a new experience that's different from what the unconscious has been programmed to expect, that rewrites the narrative, reprograms the system, and transforms the repetition. And this whole process is ultimately made possible by the experiential nature of group. Elizabeth Olsen, a leader in the local group community, says, the mechanism of repetition compulsion is often rooted in very early experiences. These experiences are stored in the amygdala and so can't just be worked with in the realm of the prefrontal cortex. Often, the healing comes from having an emotional experience that brings the amygdala online. So now let's return to our Paul story. Considering Mel's feedback, Paul reflected and shared in a group how this tendency to portray himself as dysfunctional may have developed as a strategy to get attention in a chaotic family system. The feedback he received in group helped him to see how this behavior, while once effective, was actually achieving the opposite of its desired effect for closeness in his adult life. Rather than persist with his self-denigration, Paul was able to do something different, accessing the underlying feelings and desires that were driving his behavior and expressing them in the group. The outcome was a number of group members sharing how this experience gave them a greater understanding of Paul and helped them feel more connected to him. Later, Paul shared that since having this new experience in group, he had been more consciously overriding his self-denigrating pattern and instead being more transparent about his desire for connection. he had begun to transform his repetition. So we see with Paul that once we've practiced new behaviors and had a different experience in group, we can then transfer these skills from the group room and into our outside lives. Angelo Siliberti, another local group therapist, said, "It seems like we're facing a particular challenge for those of us who really appreciate group therapy and feel like it can be of great benefit to people. Because there's this perception that those outside the group world think that group therapy is a kind of second-rate option for individual. There's a way in which group therapy seems to get disparaged, and I'm wondering if there's a way to work with that for those of us who really value it and feel like it has so much more to offer people." So, this is my attempt to do my part to debunk the misconceptions and highlight the unique advantages of group therapy. I hope that sharing my personal experience and knowledge might contribute to group therapy becoming a more widely understood, taught, and utilized form of treatment. If you're wondering who group is for or are interested in referrals or resources, I've included information about this on your handout, and you can also feel free to come chat with me after. I can talk about this stuff endlessly, but for now, I will end it here. Thank you. Yes, Trevor.
So I've been doing group for a while, and one thing I found whenever I leave an individual session, like I feel like so much, like I got so much out of it, and sometimes in a group I leave and I'm like, I don't know what that was about. So I guess I feel like I have to put a lot of trust in the group process, and that it's not always like immediately rewarding. I'm wondering what you have to say to that.
Yeah, I think that, and I was thinking about this when I made the presentation. For a presentation like this, you have to synthesize and like really drive your point home. But I think oftentimes the transformation or growth that happens in group is really gradual. And that's partially because there are so many people in the room and so many people's processes are happening at once. So unlike an individual where it's all about you, the growth can feel more immediate or obvious. But I think that, and I think also in group, it's not going to be, like the Paul example was very, it was elicited and then illuminated and then transformed, and he came back and he shared what he tried in his outside world. And I do think that happens, and sometimes there can be these big moments of like feeling like a shift happened. But I think that, and I believe this is true for individual therapy too, that a lot of times growth is gradual. And I think in life we kind of have to just trust in things. And I think if you're in a group for a year and you're still not noticing any kind of like clear growth that has happened, then maybe group isn't for you. But I do think that the growth is gradual, and I do think it also requires some conscious reflection on the ways that you might be growing to really understand what kind of development is happening for you. Yeah. Melissa.
Could you speak maybe to an experience you've had with someone who tends to hide? Like,
yeah.
Do people point that out right away, or is it?
I think that with any repetition or interpersonal behavior or pattern that we have, depending on the composition of the group and just how things transpire, it's going to be different in every group. But I believe that if you're in a group for long enough, some of your, like, whatever major interpersonal patterns that you have are going to be brought out and called out. So I think that if somebody is tending to be really withdrawn in group, they're probably going to get the feedback at some point from people being like, well, what do you have to say about this? Like, why are we all doing the work and you're just staying there quiet? Or, I'm really curious about you. I want to know what's going on with you, and I feel like I can't connect because you never share. Or if somebody is monopolizing the group, I think that group is often, what will happen is someone will be in individual therapy, and let's say there's someone in individual therapy, and their individual therapist tends to notice that they are talking a lot and kind of like bulldozing and not really attuning to the therapist, but the therapist doesn't really feel like they can say that. They might recommend that person join the group, because they know that in a group, eventually another member is going to say something like, why are you always monopolizing? It's annoying and I'm angry at you and I want you to stop. So I guess my answer to your question is yes, I think that stuff is going to get brought out and illuminated in group, yeah.
I want to add to that because I actually want to know what you think. I feel like I take some of the techniques that I've learned through different group worlds and bring them to my individual therapy. But I do it once I have enough safety established to say, hey, I'm noticing you're not attuning to me, and this is what I'm feeling as the therapist. I wonder if you feel this in the outside world. And so I'll do that a lot, actually.
As the therapist.
As the therapist. So it's something I feel very committed to in the therapy world to do, to illuminate this very thing.
I would agree with that. I would say some of what I've learned in group about not having to be discreet and about just like sharing what I'm noticing in a person. I've gotten more courageous and comfortable in doing that. And that is coming into my work with clients and being graceful about doing it, like finding a way to deliver feedback in a way that will be well received.
Yeah.
So I think it goes both ways. And I know a lot of people individual therapists who will recommend someone be in a group but also want them to keep working with them, an individual. So something I didn't get to say here is that they really complement each other. If you have the luxury of being in a group and an individual therapist, that's like an amazing opportunity. Anyone else? Okay. Thank you.